Okay, hi everyone. My name is Jeff Hunter, and I'm going to be talking about my Denali climb today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm from the Alliance area. I grew up here. I graduated from Alliance High School, class of 2000. And then after high school, I went to college in Cleveland at Case Western Reserve. I got a degree in computer science there, and that ended up taking me out to California. I worked at Apple for about 5 years after college, and then my best friend from college and I have started a software business out there in California. And many of you probably also knew my father, Robert Hunter Jr., who was an attorney in Alliance for many years. He was the assistant law director for a number of years, and he was involved in a lot of community organizations. He founded Friends of the Parks. And unfortunately, my father passed away a couple of years ago in 2017. And he was killed by a disease called frontal temporal degeneration, it's somewhat similar to Alzheimer's in that it's a progressive brain disease, but it affects a different area of the brain, and it also affects people who tend to be younger than Alzheimer's, so common onset age is between 45 and 64 years old. So after my dad died in 2017, I knew I wanted to do something to honor him and to raise money for research into FTD. And there's a charity organization out there called the Association for Frontal Temporal Degeneration. And I found them, and I wanted to do something to, like I said, honor my father and to raise money for research into FTD. Starting in about 2015, I got into mountaineering. So I was thinking of something in the field of mountaineering, and I decided that a good goal, I wanted to do something ambitious, difficult, like my dad would have wanted, and so I decided that I would climb Denali. Denali is in Alaska, formerly known as Mount McKinley, and there's a whole story behind the naming of it. It was Mount McKinley until I think 2015 when it officially became Denali, but the Alaskans have called it Denali forever, and there was a whole feud between Ohio and Alaska as to what it was going to be called. So we can get into that later if anyone's interested. Ralph Regula was actually one of the players in that story who kept it named Mount McKinley for a long time. So I was a little bit hurt that it went from Mount McKinley to Denali, being from this area. William McKinley's from Canton, but the Alaskans want to call it Denali, and that's fine. It's 20,310 feet tall, and that makes it one of the 7 summits. The 7 summits are the tallest peak on each continent, and so Denali is the tallest peak in North America at just a little over 20,000 feet. And climbing Denali is a big undertaking. You work your way up through a series of camps, and you have a lot of gear that you're carrying, so you can't just go directly up through these camps. You have to shuttle a load up and then come back down. And that helps you not only carry all the gear that you need, but also acclimate to the altitude, because when you're going up to high altitudes like this, you don't just want to go straight up there. You need to spend some time at lower elevations to let your body adapt to the elevation. So climbing Denali typically takes about 3 weeks. I was on the mountain for 22 days, I think. And so I felt this was a big, ambitious goal that would be a proper way to honor my dad. So leading up to the climb, I did a lot of preparation. First of all, on the fundraising side, we held an event out in San Jose, which is where I live right now. And we had a bunch of people there. We had a Ligretto tournament for those of you who have played that game. It's a very fun game. And I ended up getting engaged to my fiancée, Melise, at this event. Melise is around here somewhere in the back. Oh, there she is. And so that was a great event, and it helped raise money. I also, sent emails out, and I know a lot of the people in this room donated, so thank you very much. And as of last night, we're up to $32,733. So I'm very happy with that. Thank you. If anyone hasn't donated and is interested in doing so, I have the link on my last slide. So that was the fundraising side of things before the trip, but there was also a lot of preparation involved in a climb of this nature. So I did a lot of hiking in the Bay Area, which is where I live. This is Mount Diablo, which is in the Bay Area. I went there a couple of times. And Melissa and I went up to Mount Shasta, which is in far northern California, up near the Oregon border. And I did some training up there. I later learned that Melise thought I was going to propose to her on this trip, but that didn't happen. It happened a month later at the fundraising event that I showed you. And for a trip like this, there's a lot of preparation in terms of your gear. It took me months of work just to get all the gear together that you need. When you climb Denali, I went with a guided expedition, and so they give you a list of all the gear that you need, but it's a mile long, and each thing really matters because these mittens could be the difference between getting severe frostbite and losing your finger or returning with all 10 digits. So when I was looking at these mittens, I thought, well, they're really expensive, but if you divide it by 10, yeah, I think each of I think each of my fingers is worth $15, so I guess I'll buy them. And because you're out there for 21 days, you got to eat, and so there's a lot of preparation with the food, and I had my spreadsheet going, trying to figure out how I can carry enough calories with as little weight as possible. So it's all about calorie density. I like to see at least 125 calories per ounce, preferably even more. Olive oil is 200 calories per ounce. So yeah, it gives you an excuse to eat all those junky foods that you normally don't permit yourself. So I flew up to Anchorage, Alaska, and the first thing that you notice when you get to Alaska, this was in late May, this photo was taken at about 11 p.m. So it's light almost all day there. The sunrise was something like 4:30 a.m. and sunset was at midnight, but in between sunrise and sunset, it's still sort of a dawn dusk light situation. You can still walk around outside without any kind of headlamp or anything. And you also know that you're in Alaska when you're driving through Anchorage and you see a giant moose standing by the side of the road. This is in the city limits. This is not like out in the country or anything. This is within the city of Anchorage. So the first official day of the climb was May 19th of this year. And like I said, I went with a guided group. And so we all met at the airport, and I met all the people that I was going to be climbing with. And that's always a big moment. I've done some other guided climbs in the past, nothing of this magnitude, but you're always wondering, who are these other people going to be? Am I going to be the weakest person, the slowest person, the least experienced person? So you're trying to size everyone up. But we had a really good group. Originally, there were supposed to be 8 clients and 4 guides. So that's a 2-to-1 ratio, which is really nice, and one of the reasons why I went with this company. A lot of the other companies have higher ratios, but obviously you don't get as much interaction with the guides. But we had 2 clients that dropped out about a month before the trip, and then when I showed up at the airport, I found out that another client had dropped out a couple of days ahead of time. So we ended up having 5 clients and 4 guides, so we almost had a 1-to-1 client-to-guide ratio, which is great because obviously the guides do a lot in terms of helping to keep you safe, but another reason to want that kind of ratio is you're trying to learn from them. They teach you the skills that you would need to do this type of thing on your own, which is something that possibly I'd be interested in the future when I have more experience. So you can see some of the folks that were on my trip here. This guy right here, we called him Irish. He was from Ireland, but he currently lived in Australia. And it looks like he has a sunburn. He's just always really red like that. When he showed up, I was like, who is this guy who's sunburned before we even get on the mountain? But he's just always red like that. And then this was the guy that I ended up staying in a tent with, Hal, and he was from Calgary in Alberta, Canada. And then you can see these 2 here were a couple from West Virginia that were on the climb. So the 5 clients were me, Hal, Irish, and the couple from West Virginia. And the couple from West Virginia, the husband was an emergency room trauma physician, so that made my mom and my fiance feel a lot better. It's a very useful person to have on your Denali expedition. And then, like I said, we had 4 guides. The guy here in the hat was our head guide named Andy, and he's been all around the world. He lived in Alaska for a long time, but he's also climbed Mount Everest, so this guy has a lot of experience and it was really cool to learn from. So you drive up, you're on your way to Talkeetna, and you drive up there, and there's a famous overlook that you just pull off the road, and you have this view of the Alaska Range, which is the mountain range that Denali is in. And this is just a photo that I took with a cheap point-and-shoot camera. This is not some professional photo or anything. And so this is when you start to realize what you've gotten yourself into, and maybe you start to wonder how this is going to go. And then on that day, we all went out and had a team dinner. You know, it's important to have some kind of bond with these people because your life could be in their hands. So the second day was another day of prep. Everyone who climbs Denali is required to go to the ranger station there and get a briefing from the National Park Service where they tell you about a lot of things. They have this board up in the in the ranger station there, it shows you how many climbers have registered, how many of them are on the mountain, and what the summit percentage was. The current summit rate when we got there was 0%, so that was perhaps a bit ominous, but there were only 40 climbers who had finished by that point in the year. So normally people climb Denali late May and in June. So this was towards the beginning of the peak season for climbing Denali. And they've got the board up here with all the vital statistics. You can see the daylight hours. Sunrise was 4:52 a.m., sunset was 11:02 p.m., but you have enough light that you don't need a headlamp. It's kind of twilight all night long. And there's flags from all over the world in the ranger station there because people come from all over the world to climb Denali. It's one of the 7 summits, and so not only is it a great mountain to climb on its own, but there's a whole group of people who are really interested in climbing all of the 7 summits, and so that brings in people from around the world. So you go in and the rangers give you a presentation, a briefing on climbing the mountain. They give you some vital information, like every night at 8 p.m. they come over the radio and give a weather forecast. So they let you know what frequency you need to be on. And one of the most important things that they teach you how to do is how to poop on the mountain, because there are lots of people climbing Denali, about 1,000 people every year. And so people used to just throw it in crevasses on the glacier, but there's too many people now, it doesn't decompose because it's cold. And so they devised this contraption, which is called a CMC, the Clean Mountain Can. And that's where you do your business, and you're required to bring it down with you off of the mountain. And this is what it looks like on the top. No can, no climb, and they're strict about that. If you run into a ranger, they can ask to see your CMC, and if you don't have one, then they can tell you to leave the mountain, basically. And they also give you an overview. So there are many routes that you can use to climb Denali. The most popular one, which is the one that I did, is called the West Buttress route. It's considered to be the most straightforward route. So they give you a presentation on climbing that route and tell you about some aspects that you need to be aware of. So this is an infamous section of the mountain called the Autobahn. You can use your imagination as to why it's called the Autobahn. And you can see here, tired plus no protection equals 22 plus fatalities. So this is a dangerous section of the mountain. Now the main reason I put this slide in here was to see if I could make my mom have a heart attack, but she looks like she's doing okay over there. But the other reason I put this slide in there is just to illustrate that climbing big mountains is a serious business, and it's important to exercise good judgment. So when there's a book that comes out every year called Accidents in North American Mountaineering that goes through all the accidents that have occurred and sort of does an analysis of why these things happened. And usually there's a confluence of factors, but it's all bad decisions compounding upon themselves, right? So it's important to make good decisions on the mountain, not to have summit fever, which is when you're so driven to get to the top that you forget about everything else, like getting down safely. And so they show you this stuff to kind of wake you up and make you aware of what you're getting into. And then we went back to the hotel we were staying at and did a gear check, packed everything. And doing a gear check for Denali takes 2 or 3 hours because there's so much gear. And once you get out there, you're out there for 3 weeks. There's no resupply possible. So you have to make sure that you really have everything. And then I went to downtown Talkeetna, which is the little town that's sort of the gateway to Denali National Park, and had dinner there. So the third day was our day to fly out onto the mountain. We woke up bright and early. That's Andy, our head guide. We packed everything up, and you fly out onto the glacier. It's about 60 miles or so from Talkeetna. There's no roads or anything, so you have to fly out there in a bush plane. So we got all of our gear ready to go. There's tons of gear. Everyone has a big, heavy pack and also a duffel bag that you drag in a sled behind you, and you'll see that in a minute. So there's lots and lots of gear, and you have ice axes and crampons and snowshoes that have sharp points on them. So you put those separate from everything else so that you don't rip a hole in your nice down jacket. And then we headed over to the Talkeetna airport. This is the plane we were on. It's a de Havilland Otter, I believe. Yeah, it's the Otter. And Melissa asked me to send her a photo before I left, so this was the last photo she got from me for 3 weeks. And then you hop in the plane, and you're off. And this is taking off from the Talkeetna airport. This plane is kind of large for a bush plane. It probably holds about 10 people or so. And you make a little turn here, and you see the Alaska Range off in the distance, and you're on your way out to the mountain. So at first, you're flying over this forested area with these nice rivers. And as you get closer, you start to see the mountains, you start to see the glacier, and then you're getting really close to the mountains, and you have a headset on so you can talk to the pilot, and it's playing alarms, terrain warning, things like that, which normally you would be freaking out about, but you're intentionally flying close to the terrain, so you assume that the pilot knows what he's doing. And it's just really awesome. Just flying out there, if you're ever up in Alaska and you have the opportunity you can do a sightseeing flight tour up there and have this sort of experience. Flying through the Alaska range up there is just breathtaking. This is what it looks like. The scale of everything in Alaska is beyond comprehension. I mean, Alaska is bigger than Texas, California, and I forget what other state combined. So Alaska is a big place. You look out over this mountain range with all these peaks, and you're not even sure how many of them have names, let alone how many of them have been climbed. And you start to see the glacier. So the glacier that, there's a number of glaciers that come off of Denali, but the one that you climb on when you're doing the West Buttress route is called the Kahiltna Glacier. And you can see here, it's all broken up, and these are called crevasses. And the reason this happens is that you can think of a glacier as being like a river of ice. So it's a river of ice that's flowing through a valley or flowing off the side of a mountain. And so it kind of behaves like the water in a river would, just we're talking about moving inches or feet per year as opposed to water freely flowing. But when it's going up over rocks or other features, just like you would see some white water in a river, you get the same type of thing happening with the ice that's flowing over it, and you get these cracks in the ice, which are called crevasses. And sometimes they're really obvious, like this is called an ice fall, and they're basically crevasses. Sometimes they're really obvious like this, but other times they're very hard to see because there's a layer of snow covering them, and so you have to be careful not to fall into crevasses, and we'll talk about that later. And then you get out here, this is the main body of the Kahiltna Glacier, and there's a little landing strip on the southeast fork of the Kahiltna Glacier. So you're flying along the Kahiltna Glacier here, and then you make a right turn, and you'll see that in a moment. And when you make that right turn, that takes you over to the southeast fork of the Kahiltna Glacier, which is where there's a little landing strip. So this plane is on skis, so it can land on the glacier. And here's a video showing landing on the glacier. The main reason I put this in there is you can see to mark the center line of the runway, they've taken plastic sleds and jammed them into the ground, standing up vertically. So it's a little hard to see, but these little dots here, those are like those plastic sleds that kids ride in, and they have them jammed into the ground vertically. So that's the runway. And the air taxi services out there pay a base camp manager to live there all season and maintain the runway, which basically means stomping it down a little bit from time to time. And once you get off the plane there, this is what Denali Base Camp looks like. This peak right here is called Mount Hunter, and since my name is Jeff Hunter, I feel like it's my spirit mountain there. So I like saying that mountain. And then there's also Mount Foraker, which is another large peak in the Alaska range. That's about 17,000 feet tall. So it's taller than anything in the continental US, but it's shadowed by Denali. So after you get out there, you unload your gear, the plane takes off, and then you're out there for 21 days or however long it takes you, and there's no resupply or anything, so you better make sure that you have everything that you need. And the first thing that you do is you dig a cache. So all of these wands are marking people's caches. Since you have all this gear, you got to shuttle it up and down on the mountain, and you need a buffer of emergency supplies in case something happens. You dig caches, so you dig down into the snow, maybe 3 or 4 feet, and then you put gear in there that you're going to save for later. So we bury a cache at base camp because these bush planes can only fly when the weather is nice. So you might get back to base camp and be ready to fly off the mountain and still be stuck there for a few days because it's cloudy and the planes can't come in when it's like that. So you immediately dig a cache and bury some food there. That way, if you get back to base camp and you're stuck there for a few days, you have some emergency rations. And then you have to put a wand on it for a few reasons. Number one, it's going to snow while you're there, and you need to be able to find where it is even if some snow comes down. Number two, the National Park Service issues everyone a certain number of tags to put on these wands to make sure that people retrieve their caches. And if you don't retrieve their cache, they know who didn't retrieve their cache, and they write you a ticket for essentially littering on the mountain. So you dig these caches, and this is looking out over the caching area at base camp, and the peak in the background is Denali with a big ominous looking cloud. So you really don't want to be on top of Denali when there's a cloud like this. It generally means high winds. So then you start getting rigged up for glacier travel, and like I said, you got a lot of gear. So you have a big pack and you also have a sled. And I started out with about 120 pounds of gear. And there are different theories on how to distribute that between your pack and your sled. Some people say put more in the sled, some people say put more in the pack. It sort of depends on the terrain. The first day, you're mostly on flat terrain, so you're better off putting a little more in the sled, according to most people's opinions. And then you also have a harness on, and you're tied into this orange rope that goes through the sled and your harness. And then once you get out on the glacier, it looks like this, and you're tied into a rope with other members of your team. And the reason that you're tied into that rope is because of the crevasses that I was talking about. So this looks like just a snowfield, but there could be giant cracks in it. And if someone falls in there, then your rope is what holds everyone. So everyone else on the team would do what's called a self-arrest in order to hold you from falling way down in the crevasse. And then you can use the rope to haul yourself out, but it's a lot of work and you could be injured. So you definitely want to try to avoid it if you can. And so we started traveling along the glacier, and you can see these wands off to the side. So generally when teams go through, they place wands, and that's to indicate a route that other people have taken that seems to be safe. It doesn't guarantee that there's no cracks, but at least someone else has been there. And these wands are also useful if you get into whiteout conditions. You're supposed to place a wand every time you hit the length of the rope. That way, if you're in whiteout type conditions, the back guy can stop at the wand and the front guy can look around until he finds the next wand and make sure that you're on the right path. So getting back to how you climb Denali, there's a series of camps that you move up through. And so the first day we went from base camp here to Camp 1, and you start off by going down this hill called Heartbreak Hill. They call it Heartbreak Hill because you start off by going downhill. So it means that on the way back, when you're completely exhausted, the last thing that you have to do is go up a hill before you can fly out. So you go down Heartbreak Hill and you travel along the Kahiltna Glacier here to Camp 1. And that's mostly flat. So for that, we did what's called a single carry, where we took all of our gear, 120 pounds approximately per person, and just slogged it all the way to Camp 1. From there on out, you're going uphill and you can't really carry all of that stuff at once. So you tend to move up to camp with a series of carries. So what you'll do is one day you'll be in camp and you'll pack up all the things that you're not going to need for a while. So food that you don't need for a while, fuel, things like that. You'll take it up to a spot short of the next camp and cache it, bury it in the ground. Then you come back down to your original camp, sleep there. The next day you pack up your tents and everything else and take it up to the next camp and set up camp there. And then on the third day you come back and retrieve your cache and bring it up to the camp. So it takes about 3 days usually to move from one camp to the next, and that's assuming that you have good weather that permits you to move. So eventually we get to the first camp, and this is some of the scenery that you see along the way when you're traveling on the Kahiltna Glacier. And while we were there, we saw this happen, which was an avalanche coming off of the mountain over there. So I got a little video of it. You can see sort of the plume of ice and snow over there. Fortunately, that's not an area that you have to travel through. So part of mountaineering is knowing what terrain is prone to avalanches and what conditions cause avalanches and avoiding it. But we did see that avalanche there, so you have to be wary of that. And you take a break every once in a while. You usually go for about an hour to an hour and a half and then take a break. But even when you're taking a break, you're leaving the rope stretched out just in case someone would fall into a crevasse. And yeah, you know, it's just beautiful out there. So eventually we reach Camp 1, which is sort of at the base of where you really start going uphill. And this is what that camp looks like. You can see there's another group that's camped out over there on the right side. And then the instruction continues on how to poop on the mountain. Our guide, Andy, was a great guy. Not every group had these buckets with a toilet seat. That's optional. Some people just have the green cans that I showed you, and then you squat over it, but you better make sure that your aim is good. Andy went above and beyond and offered to carry this 5-gallon bucket and a lid. So this is glamping on Denali, basically, is having the bucket with a lid. So we got a little more instruction. You dig a little latrine area so you have a bit of privacy. And this is Irish, and we went to bed. So there were 3 of us in a tent. It was me, Hal, and Irish in a tent. So our plan for the next day was to take a cache up short of the next camp that we wanted to move up to. So we get up in the morning, we figure out what supplies we're not going to need for a while, we load them up into our sleds, and we start heading up this hill, which is called Ski Hill. And as you get up there, you're starting to look back. This is back the direction that we came from the landing strip. And this is a video. You're not running up these mountains, right? You're carrying a lot of weight, you're at high altitude, and so it's about a slow to moderate, steady effort for hours and hours at a time. So you're just kind of trudging along, and you spend a lot of time looking at your feet because you need to make sure that you're keeping the proper tension on that rope and that you're not tripping over that rope. So even though there's gorgeous scenery, if you look at the scenery too much, you end up tripping up the rope, or you let the rope get tight and the guy in front of you says, "What are you doing?" And that's another aspect of the physical challenge is because you're tied into this rope, everyone has to move at the same pace. You can't just take a little break if you want to. You have to keep moving, otherwise the rope is going to come taut. And so sometimes you're like, "Oh God, when are we going to take a break?" And you yell and say, "Can we take a break in the next 10 minutes because I'm starting to get worked here?" But generally speaking, you got to move at the pace of the rope team, and the rope team is set by the guide, who is in a lot better shape than most other people. Yeah, this is what it looks like going back. That's one of our guides there. And just awesome scenery all over the place. I think this is called Kahiltna Dome over there. So you get up to your cache spot and you dig a cache, which is what we're doing here. So we've unloaded our sleds. You can see Andy is standing in this hole here. We've dug this cache, and it's got to be deep because there are ravens that like to come onto the mountain, and they're smart enough to raid your caches. They'll dig them up. So it's got to be 2 to 3 feet deep. So you get down in the cache, you put all of your stuff in like a trash compactor bag or something so it doesn't get wet, and you dig it, you bury it down in the snow, put a wand on it, and then we were taking these sleds that we no longer needed and jamming them into our packs so that we could carry them back down the mountain. And while we were up there, we saw this helicopter come in. I didn't know what was going on until we got off the mountain, but some guy was skiing and I think he broke a leg or something. And so there was a rescue going on while we were up there that this helicopter came in for. So we eventually got everything packed up, and then this is what it looks like walking back down to the camp. We had the sleds in our packs at that point, and back at our camp, spend another night there. So the next day, our plan was to move up to the camp above Camp 1, and so we pack up again. And sometimes, like I mentioned, there are ravens out there. Sometimes you would see smaller birds flying around too, and this is a glacier. There's no greenery for miles around, and you wonder, where the heck are these birds coming from, and how do they survive? And the answer is they don't always. We packed up our tent, and this bird was there, and he didn't make it. So I don't know how these birds get out there, honestly. They're coming from very far away, and usually they're okay, but they don't always make it. And then this is kind of what it looks like when you have your sled rigged up. There's a whole, I'm not going to get too much into the technical side of mountaineering here because I assume most people here don't really care about that. But if you're interested, come talk to me later. There's a whole technique about how you have to lash this thing to your sled and make sure that it doesn't fall into crevasses and make sure, it's a big pain in the butt. You don't get ready to go in 5 minutes on Denali. Like, getting ready to go is a 90-minute process at least because you're getting your harness on, you're getting your sled packed up. So you have to plan ahead. And the weather wasn't great on that day. This is what it looked like when we were moving up. This is a photo of me, and you can see we're kind of in whiteout conditions there, but it wasn't too windy and there wasn't active precipitation. So lower on the mountain you can move in marginal conditions like this. Higher on the mountain you can't because it's just too cold and it's too dangerous when you can't see. But on the lower mountain you can move in conditions like this. So we did, and we got to the next camp. And once you get to camp, it takes a lot of work to get a camp ready. So you have to shovel out a platform, and sometimes you have to build walls to put around your tent because there's no vegetation or anything to block the wind, and the wind can be ferocious up there. So your reward for doing 6 hours of heavy load carrying is to spend another 90 minutes doing shoveling and putting up tents. So it's a lot of work. This is Andy kind of instructing us on his technique, and this is us putting up the tent. And we're just practicing good technique here. You can see how there's someone holding the tent, because when you're putting up a tent in high winds, if there's someone not holding the tent at all times and it gets taken by a gust, I mean, that could be a life-threatening incident if your tent gets blown away. So we're practicing good techniques here. You always want to have someone holding the tent. So the next day was a planned rest day. So it's after 6 days, we figure, okay, we're ready for a rest day. The weather was actually decent, even though the forecast wasn't that great. This is what our camp looked like. This is at about 11,000 feet on the mountain. And then that's looking up towards the next camp. So that hill there is called Motorcycle Hill. And you can see here, it's zoomed in, you can see the people going up the hill there. Some people go straight up, some people zigzag and switch back up the way. But this was a rest day, so we had a little opportunity to relax. And this is sort of what our kitchen area looks like. We have one of these big tunnel tents. And this is our stove setup. So you get all of your water when you're climbing a mountain like this from melting snow. And melting snow to make water takes a lot of fuel and takes a lot of time. And so melting water is a constant chore. As soon as you get into camp, you're turning the stove on and you're melting snow for water for hours at a time with that many people. So we have multiple stoves and we have these big pots, and someone is always in the kitchen working on melting snow so that you have water. And then this kind of shows the latrine situation. This is looking out of the dining tent over towards the latrine, and we have some little walls there built for privacy. But you can see how those wands are in an X pattern. That's the etiquette on Denali. You have these wands for marking the trails and stuff. You put two of them next to the latrine. If they're parallel, that means it's open. If there's an X, it means someone's in there, so leave them alone. These guys were going for a little ski on their off day, getting a bit frisky, walking over this giant crevasse there, but there was a lot of snow on top. But the guy in front was poking with his pole every 3 feet to see if it was stable, which it was, but it's a little bit dicey there. So these guys zigzagged up there and then they went for a ski. So the next day our plan was to take a load up short of the next camp, to go up from about 11,000 feet to about 14,000 feet. And on this day you have to traverse an area called Windy Corner, which is an infamous area on the mountain. And it turned out to be extremely windy on this day. So you can see here what it was like. Fortunately, it wasn't super cold, but even when it's not super cold, when you have winds blowing like this, it's still pretty cold. And it's also very challenging conditions because it's very difficult to take a break. You can't really put anything down. So gloves, everything on the mountain, you need to have leashes on them. You have leashes on your gloves because if you are casual with your glove, it might blow away. And if you lose a mitten, you could lose a finger. So when it's very windy like that, it's a lot of effort to do anything because you have to be super careful about not having anything blow away. But this is what it looks like when you start getting up there. First you go up Motorcycle Hill, then you go up a hill called Squirrel Hill, and then you get up and you got a really great view looking out over the Alaska Range. And then we took a break here, and this is right before you go around Windy Corner. So you go up this hill here, and then you make a left-hand turn. It's called Windy Corner. It's known to be a very windy area, of course, but it's also, you kind of traverse along a steep ridge there, so you have to be very careful. And we got up there, and we did make it around Windy Corner. It was a little bit dicey, but it wasn't too bad. This is looking out over Mount Foraker. So this is the mountain that I showed at the very beginning that you can see from base camp, but now we're up almost to 14,000 feet, so you're getting a better view of it. But like I said, Windy Corner was a little bit dicey, and so there were crevasses up there. Most of them were marked, but once we were up there, we were burying our cache and getting ready to go back down, and this happened. So another team was coming up, and apparently a guy wasn't paying attention. So you're looking at your feet, but you also got to look at the guy in front of you to see what he's doing, because if he zigs out of the way, you need to zig out of the way too. And this guy wasn't paying attention, and so there's a guy in here. He fell down into this crevasse, and this is what you do when that happens. Those guys are doing what's called a self-arrest. So they're holding him so he doesn't fall down in there anymore, because some of these crevasses can be hundreds of feet deep. And so this guy is down in the crevasse. He didn't fall in too far, but I think, yeah, there's a little video here. It takes a while to get people out. You got to set up rope teams, and there's a whole technique that we can talk about if anyone's interested. So this is them trying to get him out, but it's not easy, especially when you're wearing snowshoes and you have a heavy pack on. So they're trying to yank this guy out of the crevasse, and he's falling back in, but they did eventually get him out of the crevasse. So you have to be very careful of crevasses on mountains like this. It can happen completely unexpectedly. In this case, I think he could have avoided it, but he just wasn't paying attention. And so then after we buried that cache, we went back on down to our camp. So this is on top of that motorcycle hill looking back down onto the camp that we went down into. So the next day is another common thing that happens on Denali. It's a forced weather day. Sometimes the weather is just bad and you can't move, and Alaska is famous for multi-day long storms where you just have to hunker down. And so part of climbing Denali is a psychological test of how long you can sit in a tent and have this happening for hours and hours at a time. And I had two guys that I was sharing the tent with, so you talk about everything that you can think of. You play cards, you sit there, you have your phone, but you got to manage your battery levels very carefully because you don't want to, it's a 21-day long trip. So it's a psychological test, and you spend a lot of time in the tent on days like this because you just can't move on a mountain like this when the weather's like that, not without great risk. So this is what it looked like when the weather calmed down a little bit, but you still can't see anything. It's snowing. It's just not a good day to move. And so our reward for sitting around in the tent all day that day was to do it again the next day because the weather was still terrible, and you can see the clouds rolling through here. It was kind of windy and not good visibility, and you don't want to go around Windy Corner when the conditions are like this. So day 2 of sitting around in the tent. So finally, we get a day where we can move up. And so our goal this day was to move up to the 14,000 foot camp, which is a big camp on Denali. It's where a lot of groups tend to, you can get up to 14,000 foot camp even when weather is kind of marginal. It's hard to go past that when the weather isn't bad, when the weather isn't very good. So a lot of teams get up to the 14,000 foot camp and hang out up there. And that was our goal. So we headed on up the mountain. This is going back up. This is that same spot that I showed you where you go around, and that's Windy Corner. But it was not windy on this day. It was calm. And so it's so much nicer. You're able to sit down and take a proper break. You don't have to worry about things blowing away. And this is going around Windy Corner. This is where that guy fell into the crevasse a couple of days prior, but there were no issues on this day. We got up there to the 14,000 foot camp. And these people who are sitting over there, the company that I went with runs multiple trips on Denali. So these people that were sitting there had gone up a week prior to us, and they were on their way back down. And they all had 1,000-yard stares and weren't very talkative. And it was like, oh, okay. None of them were able to summit. They had bad weather. So it's like, oh, I guess that's going to be me in a week or so. And so you get up there and you have to build camp. And by this point, you're at 14,000 feet. And so you're really feeling the altitude, shoveling snow, you're breathing hard. It's everything that you do feels way harder than it should be. And it's actually kind of hot up there when the sun is beating down on you. I mean, it might be 5 degrees, 10 degrees Fahrenheit according to the weather report, but the UV radiation when the sun is out is really intense, and it's reflecting up off of the snow. And so when you're doing that kind of effort, you're sweating, and it can be quite hot up there. This is the view from 14,000 foot camp looking back on Mount Foraker. So you have a really great view up there. And then there's the nightly ritual of 8 p.m. weather. So like I said, they come over the radio at 8 p.m. every night, and you sit there and you wait for the weather forecast. So the base camp manager is down there reading off the weather forecast, and everyone's wondering, oh, are we going to get a weather window? Is this good news or bad news? So the next day we had to go back and get our cache at Windy Corner. This is a photo looking from our camp at people going up the mountain. We weren't ready to go up yet. We went back down and retrieved our cache at Windy Corner. And then we knew some weather was coming in, so we decided that we would build some walls around our tent. This is something that you have to do a lot on Denali because of the storms and the fact that there's nothing to block the wind. There's no vegetation or anything. And so you dig a pit. You have what's called a snow saw so that you can saw it. And you'll see here, one guy is sawing, the other guy's using a shovel to pop the blocks out. And the snow in Alaska is great. The blocks form up really nicely. So it's not as easy to do this in Ohio probably, but in Alaska, the blocks pop out like that. And Irish, one of the guys on our team, is a professional stonemason. That's what he does in Australia. So our walls were really good. And he was over there with the saw, making sure everything was level and getting it all built up there. This is looking back out. And we went all out. The name of the company that I went with is International Mountain Guides. So we had the IMG Denali sign there. You got to mark your camp so people who are coming up can find you. But that's a lot of work, so we took a nap. That's me on the left with on the top with my mask on. You got to have a mask up there because it doesn't actually get dark even in the middle of the night. And then our evening entertainment here is these guys skiing down the mountain. I don't know if you can see it, these little dots right there. Those guys went up to about 17,000 feet and were skiing down. So yeah, we watched them on the very top of the mountain. There's a couple of places where you're like, oh man, if they fall here, it's going to be all over. But they were really good skiers and they made it down. And that camp that's at the bottom there, that's the National Park Service Patrol. The National Park Service has a camp up at 14,000 feet with rangers on duty. So the next day ideally would have been a rest day, but we knew that there was some weather coming in, so we decided to continue going up the mountain and to take a load up short of the next camp. Like I said, you get into these rhythms of taking a load up, caching it, coming back down, moving up to the next camp, going down to retrieve your cache. It takes 2 or 3 days to move up between camps. So this is going up the hill outside of the 14,000 foot camp, looking back down on camp. And eventually you reach an area called the head wall where it starts to get really steep. And in order to protect that area, they have fixed ropes in. So you can see there's a rope on the left here and a rope on the right. One is for people going up and one is for people coming down because this is really steep and you don't want to fall here. And so that person there is coming down. On the way down, there's various techniques where you hold onto the rope, and you mostly just holding onto the rope and the friction of that is okay. On the way up, you use what's called an ascender. So this is not my video. I got this off of YouTube. I was too busy making sure that I didn't die to be filming videos, but this guy apparently was willing to make a video. So you have this ascender on your harness, and then you clip it onto the rope like that, and you start making your way up, and that ascender will slide up the rope, but it won't come back down. So if you were to fall, it would catch you, which is important because it's probably about 50 or 60 degrees angle here. And so you slide the rope up through your ascender, and it's what's called a progress capture device because it'll slide up, but it won't come back down. And so it'll hold you if you fall. And then you'll see he looks up here. So you can see how steep it is here. These are the other guys on his team. So we finally got up through the fixed lines there, and this is what it looks like up there, taking a little break. And we dug a cache up there and buried our stuff. This is what it looked like on the way back down. So once you get up above the fixed lines, you're walking along this ridge line, which is really awesome views all around you. And so at this point, we're kind of ready to move up to the upper mountain and make our summit attempt, but it's all about the weather. So 8 p.m. weather, we're sitting around waiting for the forecast to come in, and it sounded like a weather front was moving in, and so we figured we were going to have a couple of rest days in camp. Because once you start moving up beyond this camp, you have to keep moving to the top of the mountain. If you hang out above 14,000 feet for too long, you're just getting weaker, you're getting tireder. And so it's all a matter of timing. You want to hit your weather window and make it and get back down. You don't want to go up there and then have to hang out for multiple days. So we spent most of the day in the tent relaxing. By this time I'm getting very, very tired. So I was glad to have a rest day. This is what the conditions were like, just kind of overcast, couldn't really see much. So we hung out in the tent and we drank a little, which is not recommended. It's actually not good for acclimation to be drinking, but we were bored. It hits you more. At 14,000 feet, one drink is the equivalent of 2 at sea level. So you have to show a little bit of temperance there. So the next day, another rest day, still can't move up, but we thought that there was going to be a weather window on the day after that. So we prepared to move up to the 17,000 foot camp. This is the 14,000 foot camp. We prepared to move up to the 17,000 foot camp starting at 4 a.m. the next day. So we woke up really early and we went up past the fixed lines, and this is on the ridge line once you're above the fixed lines. And then you start moving through terrain like this, and there's a technique happening here called running belays. So this is steep and you don't want to fall here. And so other teams that have come up have pounded pickets into the snow here. So there's a picket with an anchor on it, and then you clip into it, and then once you get to the picket, you have to clip around it and get onto the other side of it. But the team is clipping into these running belays so that if someone were to fall, that would help to prevent you from falling all the way. And yeah, this is what it looks like up there. You can see that those specks in the lower left-hand corner, that's the 14,000-foot camp that you're looking back down on. This is another area where you have those running belays because you don't want to fall here. So you can see that we're clipped into the rope here, and you're being very careful. And yeah, once you get past that, you're walking along this ridge line, which can be very exhilarating when it gets kind of narrow. A couple of times I was starting to be very ginger and careful, and the guide would yell at me and say, it's wider than a sidewalk, just pretend that you're walking on a sidewalk. But it's one thing to walk on a normal sidewalk and another thing to walk on a sidewalk that has a 2,000-foot drop off on either side. You start overthinking things a bit, but it really isn't that narrow. It's just you're freaking yourself out because you're looking around too much. This is another area where you got to move through some protection to make sure that you don't fall. And then eventually you get up along this ridge line. You follow that ridge line to the 17,000-foot camp, which is where we are here. And now you're at the 17,000-foot camp. You got to build walls. You got to dig a platform. And it's getting really hard to do this at 17,000 feet. You're breathing hard. And it was really windy up there. So we spent a lot of time in the tent looking at this. And we went to bed. And then we woke up in the morning, and it was still really, really windy. It had been windy all night. And I wrote in my journal that night, I used to think that every place in the mountains had its own beauty, no matter how austere, but I'm not so sure now. 17 Camp is a windswept hellhole. So that's how I felt about it. It really was miserable up there. Now, the weather did clear up and you get really great views up there, but at 17,000 feet, a lot of things are difficult. And so this is looking up beyond 17,000 feet. You can see this line here. This is where people climb up. This is the Autobahn area. But you see it's called spin drift, the snow that's blowing off the top of the mountain there. And when you see that spin drift, it means that there's high winds up there and you really don't want to be up there. So when you see that kind of activity going on, you're not going anywhere because now you're at 17,000 feet. At night, the temperature is going down to maybe negative 25 or negative 30 degrees. And so in the day, the high is maybe negative 10 or negative 5. When you add wind chill in on that, you can't go up when it's windy. If you have naked skin exposed for 30 seconds, you can get frostbite in those types of conditions. So you got to wait for your weather window here. You can't go up beyond here without good weather. So we decided to reinforce our camp after a night of having our tents blowing around. So we started quarrying blocks and piling them up around our tents here. And our guide, Andy, who's a total badass in the mountains, I was dead tired after building up these walls. He decided to build an igloo. Because once you get up to this camp, we don't have our dining tent. It's too much effort, too much weight. You don't want to carry a bunch of things up here. But you still need a shelter for cooking. So he built this igloo, and then inside is where we were cooking and melting our water for snow. So you can see here, this is Johnny, I believe, one of our guides who's in there melting. So you take a trash bag, put snow in that, and then take it to your stove and shovel it into the pot so that you can melt water. So at this point, we're hoping that we're going to be able to move up from the mountain. You're at 17,000 feet. You go up to the summit from here at 20,000 feet. So there's no more camps. You're at the final camp. You're hoping that you can move up. And the next day, very windy, no chance of moving up. I'm not sleeping very well up here at 17,000 feet. People generally don't. And so I'm starting to get kind of rocked. But one of our guides, Betsy, actually got a case of pulmonary edema, which is when your high altitude pulmonary edema, which is when your lungs start to fill with fluid due to the altitude. And so she had to go back down. 2 of the guides took her back down. The only real treatment is to descend. So one of our guides left 17K camp on this day. She wasn't feeling very well at all. I wasn't sleeping very much up there because it's just hard to sleep at 17,000 feet, especially when it's windy like that. And you can see, again, lots of wind coming off of the mountain. Just not possible to climb in these conditions. So we hang out, we melt snow for water, and we do a little walking around. You don't want to just be totally physically inactive. That's not good for acclimation to altitude. So you want to walk around a little bit. This is looking down. You can see the dots down there. That's the 14,000 foot camp from the 17,000 foot camp. This one is zoomed in a little bit more so you can see that. And then the National Park Service has this giant winch up there with a 3,000 foot long rope on it. They call it the rescue gully, that gully that you're looking down. So if things go really bad, I mean, I wouldn't be excited about this, but it's better than nothing. They basically put you on a backboard and then lower you down the side of the mountain with this 3,000 foot long rope to get you down to the 14,000 foot camp. Because the 14,000 foot camp, they actually have some medical supplies there and stuff. The 17,000 foot camp is much more minimal. This is what it looks like, someone coming into the camp. And you can see they have their wands ready if they need to mark anything. And that's where this photo came from, where I'm up there. So you got an awesome view of Foraker. Foraker is about 17,000 feet tall, and you're at about 17,000 feet on Denali, so you're sort of looking out right at the summit. But after not sleeping very well for the past couple of nights and just feeling the altitude a lot, on this day, we thought there might be a weather window the next day to go for the summit, and I decided that I wasn't going to attempt the summit because I didn't feel very good, and I hadn't been sleeping well, and just walking around camp, I was totally winded. And so I didn't want to put my teammates or anyone in danger, which is what happens when someone gets stuck up there. And so I agonized about this, right? I spent months preparing for this and so much money getting the gear, and I wanted to honor my dad, and I wanted to make it to the top, but part of what my dad gave me was good decision-making skills, and I decided that I'd rather come back alive than be a hero and try to go for the summit. It ended up not, so I agonized about this, it's not an easy decision to make. It ended up not mattering at all because no one made it to the summit because we never got a weather window. But the next day, this is what it looks like in the morning. This is the zipper pool on the tent. So just like the condensation or the moisture in your breath overnight crystallizes on everything when you're up at that altitude. The other two guys who were still with us, the couple from West Virginia turned around at 14,000 foot camp. They weren't feeling very well there. So there were two other guys who were still with us. They decided to make a summit attempt on this day. And the weather looked pretty good. So they're getting suited up here. You can see they've got their big puffy jackets on. They've got what are called over boots. So you have big heavy mountaineering boots on, and then boots on these neoprene booties that go over top of that because it's so cold that you need those. And this is Johnny, our guide. You can see he's got a balaclava on over his face. You just take a balaclava and cut a little slit in it to breathe through, because you don't want to have any exposed skin. When you're going above here, like I said, it could be 0 degrees with winds, or negative 10 degrees with winds, and so you can't have any exposed skin here. And so they started heading out over to the Autobahn, and after about an hour, they came back to camp. Hal, who was one of the other guys, had decided that he just didn't feel very well and that he was going to come back, which is exactly what would have happened to me if I had tried to go. And so they brought Hal back to camp, and then they took Irish back out. Irish was super strong. He's climbed Mount Vinson, which is the tallest peak in Antarctica. He's working on Everest. And so he's trying to do the 7 summits. He really wanted to make it. So they went back out. But the problem is we had several days of bad weather where no one could go, and then we had a day that looked pretty good. And so everyone in camp was trying to go. And you can see there's a huge traffic jam here. There's like 100 people on this stretch of the mountain, which is a dangerous stretch of the mountain to begin with, and it's more dangerous when it's crowded. And so they got stuck in the back of this traffic jam because they had come back to camp to bring Hal back. And that ended up being a good thing, because about an hour after this, a freak snowstorm blew in and dropped about 6 inches of snow on our camp in an hour or so. And people who were higher up on the mountain were starting to, their ice axes were vibrating because of the electric potential. So it wasn't lightning strikes, but it was like a thunderish snowstorm, and their ice axes were vibrating. And when that happens, it's time to get down. So these are the 3 guys. They took a photo. This is in a whiteout. This is at the 17,000 foot camp, but they took this photo so that they could claim they were on the summit if they wanted to, because you can't see anything. It's like But you can see here, this tent was completely dug out. You have to keep the tent dug out so that you get some airflow, and that helps prevent condensation and a lot of other things. And so in just an hour or so, this is how much snow dumped on our tent. So I had to dig it out after that. So the next day, the only client who was left in the game was Irish, this really strong guy, and he wanted to try again. So they made one last valiant attempt. But it was a windy day. You can see the spin drift coming off. So it was they knew they were going to have to turn around, but they wanted to say that they tried everything possible to reach the summit. They went up a ways up the Autobahn and then came back down because the conditions were just too cold, too windy, it's too risky. So I took a couple of photos, one to shill for my company, AnyList. If anyone wants a pitch on that, you can come talk to me after. It's an iPhone and Android app that makes it really easy to share a list with your spouse, your roommates. But this is not about that. I also took a photo for FTD, which is the charity that I raised money for, and I'm actually on the cover of their annual report that just came out, so that's nice. And this is the photo. So Melise was trying to convince me to take these banners up there, and I was like, I don't want to carry any extra weight. I have 120 pounds of gear. I got to cut everything down to the minimum. But she convinced me to take these banners up there, and now I'm on the cover of the annual report, so I guess it all worked out. But yeah, Irish came back down to camp. The conditions were deteriorating. There just wasn't any way that it was going to happen, so we packed up camp, and we headed back down to the 14,000-foot camp. And by this point, you've been on the mountain for 20 days. 20 days. And so people are ready to leave, right? We're not like messing around and dilly-dallying. So we get back down to 14,000-foot camp. We did sleep in, and we had a big breakfast because we no longer need to ration our food. In fact, we want to get rid of this food so we don't have to carry it. So the 14,000-foot camp, there's a whole economy up there where people are trying to give you their food and fuel when they leave because they don't want to carry it. But someone has to actually get it off of the mountain if it's not going to be consumed. So the last groups up there have to be careful about how much they accept because they don't want to be the ones stuck with 40 pounds of fuel that you don't need. But there's a whole barter economy up there around fuel and food and people trying to give it away, people who need food. This is looking back up towards the head wall area. You can see there's a lot of people starting up for the summit now. And here is another photo of that. It's a little hard to see on this projector, but these people are all on the fixed lines right here. So the fixed lines tend to become a traffic jam because it's a bottleneck and people who don't know what they're doing on the ropes are slow. And so you can be standing there for hours waiting for people to move through. But we're on our way down, not on our way up. We pack up everything. We're getting all of our gear ready to go. One last look at Foraker. There's a lot of gamesmanship around parceling out loads. You know, it's sort of like one person makes the loads and other people choose them so that no one's giving anyone a heavier load than they should have. So we have all these bags. These are the group gear that we need to carry. We're getting ready to go. We get back down to the 11,000-foot camp. And by this time, my pack is getting absolutely ridiculous. This is a 105-liter pack, which is gigantic for anyone who's into backpacking. And I don't have enough room. I have my pad sticking out the top. I've got snowshoes strapped onto my helmet, my ice axe. Like, this thing probably weighed about 70 pounds at this point, but I just want to get out of there. This is an advanced technique where a guy is skiing while pulling a sled behind him, which is very difficult to do. You got to be a really good skier. He's an independent climber. He's not with our group. And so we're heading back down. We're ready to get off of the mountain. And like I said, you can be stuck at the base camp for days waiting for the planes to come in if the weather is bad. So if you think you got a weather window, you want to get down there because you don't want to mess around and then not be able to fly out for 3 or 4 days because of the weather. So it looks like we're going to have okay weather. We're trying to get down there. This is what it looks like heading on back down to the base camp. So we get back to the first camp that we stopped at, not the base camp, but the first camp where we camped. And it's about 8 p.m. and it's light 24 hours a day. So we decided that we'll just cook dinner here out in the open, eat dinner, and then we'll leave for the base camp around midnight. So this is midnight, and we're getting ready to go. This is about 2 o'clock in the morning. So this is what it looks like at 2 o'clock in the morning. We're just going all night. And the later in the season that you get, so this is getting into June, the more that you want to do this, because it's, like I said, it can be very hot when you're on the glacier with all the sun reflecting back up at you. And so the later in the year you go, a lot of teams will move on the lower glacier on purpose at night because it's cooler at night and it's light 24 hours a day, so why not move at 2 a.m. and not be sweltering? So eventually we get back to the base camp. It's like 3:30 in the morning or so. The planes don't start flying until about 8 a.m. But we don't want to set up our tents. It's too much work. So and it's nice weather. So we just throw our pads out on the snow and we sleep out in the open, which is called cowboy camping. And so we're cowboy camping at base camp on Denali. We're just hoping that the planes can fly in the morning. This is what it looks like in the morning. So there's some clouds. We don't know if the planes are going to be able to get in. you're just sitting on your pack waiting, hoping that a plane can get in. I'm ready to get out of there. I haven't taken a shower in 3 weeks. But we're sitting around waiting and waiting, and then finally a plane gets in. We know that we're going to be able to get out that day. But then you have to wait. There's, first come, first served. So whoever was there first gets the first plane out. We had to wait a little while. Eventually we got out. We took this little plane on the way out. This is a de Havilland Beaver, I believe. One is the Otter, one is the Beaver. I think this is the Beaver. It's a tiny little plane, and there's 2 seats in the front and a bench in the back that we've got 3 people crammed into. And I'm pushed into the side door, so I'm really hoping that that door doesn't fly open when we take off, because I'm jammed into the side of the plane at this point. But the door was locked, so it's fine. And this is what it looks like taking off from base camp, looking back out over the glacier. You can see how cramped it is in there. Really cool views of the Kahiltna Glacier, these huge ice fields there. And then eventually you see vegetation, green vegetation. I haven't seen that in 3 weeks. And Alaska has these really amazing rivers, these huge braided channel rivers that redirect each year. And so the rivers up there are just incredible. And eventually we get back to Talkeetna. Here's us coming in, landing on the runway at Talkeetna. And it's the first time that anyone has had internet access in 3 weeks. So everyone rushes to their phone to see what has happened, and nothing really that interesting has happened, world news-wise. Andy, though, is the stoic Zen master amongst us who doesn't immediately get onto his phone because he says that he likes to properly process the trip for about an hour before he whips his phone out. So respect to Andy. So we get all of our gear back to the hotel. You got to go to the ranger station and check out. At this point, the summit percentage has increased from 0 to 47%, but we're not going to help that. And so we check out with the ranger, and it was interesting. This ranger was the ranger who was up at the 17,000 foot camp the day before that we had been talking to. And it's like, whoa, how did he get down here? Well, he got down there on a helicopter because someone had tried to go up the mountain on one of those days when we decided not to, that it wasn't feasible. And this climber got stuck out at about 19,000, 20,000, or 18,000, 19,000 feet overnight. And so this ranger was involved in a helicopter rescue of the guy who ended up losing 10 fingers and 5 toes, I think. It was either 5 fingers and 10 toes or 10 fingers and 5 toes, but either way, it's not good. So we check out with this ranger, and he tells us this whole story because we were very surprised to see him there. We thought he was at 17,000 feet, and meanwhile, he's back at the ranger station. And then this was incredible to me. These are the clean mountain cans. So you got to poop in the bucket and bring the bucket off of the mountain. And they're so high tech here that they actually have an iPad with an RFID reader on it. And this is the ranger scanning our poop to make sure that we've brought back all of the buckets. You got to return all of your buckets. So he's using an RFID reader to make sure that we've returned all of our buckets full of poop. And this is like, I know I'm living in the future when this is happening. So after he scans all of these buckets and makes sure that we brought, they reserve the right to fine you if you don't bring back enough, because you're out there for 3 weeks. They have an idea of how much you should bring back. If you only bring back 1 bucket full, then they know that some stuff wasn't properly disposed of. But that kind of blew my mind. After he does that, you take all of your buckets to this bin, this pen here, and I feel really, really sorry for the intern that has to deal with that. But that's all we have to do. So we go out for a big team dinner. I take my first shower in 3 weeks, which was glorious. And this is the menu at the restaurant. Irish decides to get the Seward's Folly, which is 2 pounds of caribou, ½ pound of smoked ham, 12 strips of bacon, 6 ounces of Swiss cheese. You're really hungry. You eat a big meal when you get off the mountain, and then 2 hours later, you want another big meal. I lost about 10 pounds, I think, on the trip. And then, of course, for the next week after we get off of the mountain, the weather is perfect. This is from the Denali National Park blog, and you can see it's from June 14th, so it's about a week after we got off the mountain, and it says, Denali's summit percentage continues to rise during ridiculous stretch of clear, calm weather. So that's just how the game is played, right? You know that there's a good chance that you're not going to be able to summit through no fault of your own, and then as soon as you get off of the mountain, everyone's able to summit. So I was with this company called IMG. The group that went up before me, no one got to summit. My group, no one got to summit. The next group going up, 100% summit rate. So it's just the way that the mountaineering game is played, and that's why you have to make good decisions, because if you push it and force yourself to go to the summit when it's not there, then you're gonna get yourself hurt or get other people hurt. But bringing this all back to my dad, since this was about honoring my dad, I feel like the way that it turned out was actually good, because my dad was all about building character, and whenever I would complain about something, he would say that it built character. So I feel like my dad would say that spending 21 days on the mountain, 6 months training, suffering at 17,000 foot camp, and not making it to the summit was a character building experience. So that's my talk. If you're interested in contributing, this is the link, and I'll take some questions. Thank you. Sure.
Well, I've got two.
Okay.
The company that you went with, did you have to prove to them in some way that you were physically able to do this?
Yeah. So both the company that I went with, as well as the National Park Service, require you to submit a climbing resume. And the National Park Service, whether you go with a guided company or not, you have to get a permit from the National Park Service, and they ask you what other climbs you have done and what kind of experience you have. So I cut that out for length, but I've climbed Mount Rainier. I climbed Mount Rainier in 2018. I went up to Alaska in 2017 and did a mountaineering seminar, which teaches you some of the skills that you need. I climbed Mount Shasta in California. But yeah, they require you to show some level of experience because they don't want to be responsible for rescuing you.
You didn't have to physically prove it to them in any way?
They reserve the right to tell you no when you show up, right? So it's in your own best, with no refund. So it's in your best interest to show up in shape. And they provide a lot of information about the types of training. And I could give a whole talk on just how to train for something like this, because it's a lot of work. But yeah, they reserve, the guide company reserves the right to say, we're not taking you up there because you're a liability. So I did a lot of training.
And what about the interaction between the group?
Well, yeah, that's part of the nervous energy when you first meet the group of people. You don't know who the guides are, or maybe you've talked to them on the phone once or something, but you don't really know the guides, you don't know the other clients, and so you have to size it up. But people who are crazy enough to spend their vacation doing something like this tend to all be kind of wired in the same way. And so I've honestly never, on all the trips that I've been to, I've always made friends and never really had an issue, because you have to be kind of nutty to spend a bunch of money in 3 weeks to go suffer on a mountain like this. And so, like I said, the people who do this type of things tend to be wired in the same way that I am. And so, yeah, that all works out. But the group dynamics are really important, because you're putting your lives into other people's hands. And so you're sussing people out, but didn't have any issues with that on this trip, fortunately. Yeah. Would I try it again to get to the summit? Not anytime soon. It's a lot of work, it's a lot of effort, and I try not to be too ego-driven about climbing. Some people on the mountain really want to do all the 7 summits, and they really don't care about anything else. I do it more for the challenge of it, and I enjoy being outdoors, and so I would never say never, but if I'm going to spend that much time and effort working on a climbing project, I would probably rather go somewhere and climb a mountain that I haven't climbed before, rather than going back to Denali and doing something that I've already done again. So when I first got off of the mountain, I basically said never, but now I'm saying, like, well, probably not within the next 5 years, but after that, I don't know. Yeah.
What made you choose Denali and not like Mount Everest?
A lot of things. I had been up to Alaska before, and Denali is a very beautiful, aesthetically pleasing mountain to me. And it's also the highest peak in North America, the highest peak in the US, so there's a little bit of patriotic pride there, I guess. I don't have any interest in Everest. Everest probably has too much objective danger, is too expensive, is too overrun. I mean, you've probably seen, if you follow Everest climbing, these photos of the mountain just being overrun by people who leave a bunch of garbage on the mountain. So I feel like Everest isn't my thing. I don't know, I just really like Denali as a mountain, but like I said, if I were gonna go climb something else, I wouldn't go climb Denali again right away. There's lots of other places to go climb that would be beautiful. A lot of people that I know have gone to Ecuador. There's these amazing volcanoes in Ecuador, and different places in Colorado. So there's just so many mountains out there that I don't want to go do this one again right away. But it's a big, challenging peak. Denali is aesthetically pleasing, and so I was just drawn to it.
Roughly how much did it cost?
One more thing, and then I'll come back to the other thing that I liked about Denali is on Denali, there's no Sherpas or anything. You have to carry everything yourself. And so there's this culture on Everest of people paying $120,000 to climb Everest, and they have a small army of Sherpas carrying everything for them, and they never carry more than 20 pounds, which that's fine, I guess, maybe, whatever, but that's not, I wanted to do this to honor my dad, and so I felt like I had to really make myself suffer. So I wanted to carry, all the weight, and on Denali you carry 120 pounds. How much does it cost? Well, it depends on whether you include all the gear. Probably the boots I was wearing, for example, are $850. I got them on sale. But I mean, again, you're talking about whether you have toes at the end of the climb or not. So some of the gear can be rented, but the gear alone, I'm guessing, even if you like rented a bunch of stuff and got the cheapest versions, probably $5,000 worth of gear to climb something like this. But you can reuse it in the future, of course, if you buy it. The guide companies, they all have a permit from the National Park Service, so their prices are pretty similar, and it's about $10,000 for a trip like this. So it was a big trip for me, but I felt like I'm not going to be able to do this when I retire, right? It's like it's now or never, and so I decided that I was willing to spend the money, and they provide all the meals and handle all the logistics, including flying out and stuff. So when you divide it by the number of days, it is expensive. It's expensive. It's not, in no way is it inexpensive, but I feel like it's worth it. I now have a once in a lifetime type of experience to talk about.
Even at that price, just really think of the character you built.
Well, yeah, exactly. Character building isn't always cheap, I suppose. So yeah, that was my big trip for the next while. I mean, eventually I would like to be able to do something like that on my own, but I don't have enough experience yet to do something like that. Even if you're doing it on your own, you got to take 3 weeks off of work and get all the food and stuff. It can be expensive. Any other questions?
At what elevation would you have used oxygen tanks?
On Denali, you don't need oxygen. Denali goes up to about 20,000 feet. Generally, with big mountain climbing, people start using oxygen maybe around 25,000 feet or so. Although there's a community of people that climb mountains like Everest with no supplemental oxygen, which makes it way more difficult. But yeah, generally speaking, you don't use oxygen unless you're in the Himalaya, and that's where all the 8,000 meter peaks in the world are. Oxygen is very heavy, so it's kind of a trade-off there. Like, you're not just going to casually take it up there. These tanks are heavy and a pain to deal with. And so you don't usually start using oxygen until about 25,000 feet. Yeah?
What medications did you take to counteract the altitude sickness?
Well, there's a variety. The main one that people take is called Diamox. And if you ever go to like Peru or some of these other high altitude places, in some parts of the world, it's an over-the-counter drug. In the US, it's prescription, but it's not too hard to get. And that helps. It speeds up the acclimatization process, taking Diamox. It actually acidifies your blood, and somehow that helps speed up the acclimatization process, but it also makes carbonated beverages taste awful, so don't try to drink Coke when you take it. So mainly Diamox is the thing. I mean, ibuprofen, painkillers and stuff for the aches and pains of climbing. And then there's a couple of drugs that I had with me that I didn't take that are for emergencies only. There's one called nifedipine, and I forget what the other one is called. Those are for if you get things like high altitude pulmonary edema where your lungs are filling up with fluid. You still got to get off the mountain as quickly as possible, but they give you more time. So yeah, there's a whole field of high altitude medicine where a lot of research has been done, and that's one reason that the National Park Service has that camp at 14,000 feet, is that they do research studies up there, and doctors from the Army and other branches of the military will come up there and do research on high altitude medicine. So if you're into the medical side of things, there's whole books out there about high altitude medicine. Anything else? Okay, thanks for coming.
Jeff, did you say that, good job, sir.
Thank you.